Good evening, gentlemen. Better late than never. We are in the middle of studying the third chapter of the Holy Tanya. My plan is, God willing, to either finish the chapter today or next week, God willing. That's the plan. We're going to read until the end of the chapter. I don't have any more outside information. I have no more full class reviews like last week to share. God willing, we are going to push forward to the end of the chapter because, as we've been discussing, most of the rest of the information in the chapter, or at least the basics of it, we've already discussed in previous classes. Chapter 3 of Tanya, of course, is about what the godly soul is. Of course, in chapter 2, we said that the godly soul of a Jew is that literally a piece of God above. A piece of God above in the most literal sense. However, this doesn't tell us really, but what is the soul in the sense of what is the table or what is the chair? What is the godly soul of a Jew in terms of its finite definition, its rational definition? How does it relate to other things? What does it mean in the world of existences, in the regular world of things? Not in its root, not in its source, not in its deepest self-contained identity, which is as a literal piece of God above. And the answer is that what the godly soul is mind and emotion, intellect and personality, seichel and midos. And the intellect and the emotion of the godly soul is comprised of 10 faculties. It breaks down into 10 different aspects, you could say. 3 intellectual and 7 which are emotional. 10 aspects which reflect the 10 divine traits, the 10 spheros, the 10 supernal traits with which God relates to that which is external to him. The 10 traits by which God becomes a defined being, in a very loose sense of that term. So if we could say such a thing, so to speak. And more specifically, our chapter has been discussing, after we discussed what all 10 of them are and what they're named, and a little bit about their relationship with each other, these 10 traits, we've gotten into a whole discussion here in the second half of the chapter, all about the way that the intellect and emotions are related to each other in the godly soul. As I keep underscoring, it works differently in the animal soul. In the animal soul, these relationships are very different, as we'll, God willing, discuss in later chapters of the Tanya. But the godly soul is primarily intellectual, which means that the godly soul's existence is primarily directed towards its own source. It's primarily directed inward, to what's above it, toward the source of its own existence from the inside, rather than outward in relation to or in standing relative to the external reality, which is really what the emotions are. The animal soul is defined primarily by its external relations in a profound sense. And the truth is we'll, God willing, in later chapters, we'll refine this better of what exactly we mean by this. The godly soul, on the other hand, is all about its own source. The godly soul is all ultimately about knowing God and bringing that knowledge down into emotions as the second step. In other words, in the godly soul, everything works in order. First, you have a direct connection with God, as discussed in chapter 2. Then you bring that down into intellect and emotions in order, which is discussed in chapter 3. And then that translates in turn into actual outward expression, which is thought, speech, and action, which we'll begin to talk about, God willing, in chapter 4. In the godly soul, everything works, so to speak, in the way the theoretical order should work, which is why when we read about it, it may sound a little hard to relate to even, or a little maybe not as directly in our experience, because we are much more used to dealing with the animal soul, the other soul of a Jew, which works in a very different manner, and which is defined by in a whole different way. Even though it has all of the same parts, more or less, it's defined in a very different way and relates in a very different way, and the difference is quite profound. But we'll talk about the difference more, God willing, when we get to the later chapters about the animal soul. For now, we are talking about the godly soul. And we've been explaining how the godly soul thinks about God, of course, because it has no interest in anything else, and the truth is no real fundamental connection with anything else. Its fundamental connection is an inner connection with God, is its inner relationship with its own Creator. That fundamental immediate relationship, which may be called later in our classes, may be called emunah, or faith. It has other names as well in different aspects. You could call that fundamental, essential relationship Mesiras Nefesh. You could call it Kabbalas O. There's all different ways that this essential relationship expresses itself. But that fundamental, essential chapter 2 relationship with God, the way the soul knows God as it knows itself, it has fundamentally a piece of godliness. That relationship then translates down into what's called Chochmah and Bina, into the intellect. The intellect is what the soul uses to build itself as a separate being, to construct itself relative to the truth that it is. This is called the intellect. The intellect generally is the means by which the soul constructs its own self relative to external realities, external beings. And then you have the emotions. This then translates into emotions where, as defined by the contours of its understanding, as defined by the shape of the self that the soul has constructed, there it then goes on to actually being a thing that can relate to others. And the thing that relates to others is defined, what we might call a personality, is defined by its likes and its dislikes, what it's attracted to and what it wants to run away from, what draws it closer and what pushes it further, what it wants to attach to or detach to. You could use all sorts of paradigms in English that may make sense. That is the emotional qualities of the soul. And this process of the intellect and the emotions are collectively what define the soul as a finite being. The soul is literally a connection with God. It's literally a piece of God, the godly soul that we're discussing. And this soul then comes into full being, able to relate to other beings externally through this process of intellect and emotion, which is why the intellect and emotions are called the fixed garments of the soul. They're called the soul's body, so to speak, its spiritual body, the spiritual form through which it externally relates is the intellect and the emotions. The intellect and the emotions define the soul and pin it down, peg it to being a finite being. They set it as a being which could relate to other beings externally. And we gave the example in previous classes. Recently, we've been talking about the example of how the soul contemplates the greatness of God and brings that perception of God's greatness into full comprehension with all of its dimensionality. There's different types and different ways in which God is great. In fact, infinitely many ways. And then according to the depth and the form and the shape of its appreciation and contemplation, of its immanentization, of its drawing down of the perception of God's greatness, which is by definition, since it has become comprehended and dimensional with its shape and with all different aspects and different levels, it obviously becomes individuated. It becomes different for each person because, for example, one day one soul might contemplate Mamale Kolamin, the way that God is immanent within even finite creations. And a different soul on a different day might contemplate Tzevev Kolamin, the way that God is not nature, the way God transcends nature, He's beyond nature, the God of the miraculous. And according to these different contemplations, so are shaped and formed the different emotions of the soul. Primarily what we've been discussing so far is the one of Yira, in the side of fear of God, right? Both an intellectual fear of God, which is a form of bittul, a form of self-nullification, and then the emotional fear of God, which of course expresses in a much more blunt and in a much more coarse and in a much more worldly way in the emotions. And then, of course, as we're going to start reading now, as we're going to start reading in this class, God willing, we're going to talk about the love side of it. And this, generally speaking, describes the soul's process, the godly soul's process of going from being a pure piece of God, which is totally self-contained, and becoming the finite being, where we describe the godly soul as existing in interaction with the animal soul and the body, as we're going to go on and discuss in later chapters. That all has to do with the intellect and the emotions of the soul. It's the way the godly soul steps into the regular world as we perceive it, the rational world, the world of finite beings, limited beings, defined beings in relation with one another. So the plan is we're just going to read, God willing. As I explained last week, which last week was entirely a review class. So if any of you feel a little rusty on the chapter, you go watch last week's class, because last week's class was in 100% review. Today, God willing, we're going to read and go forward. And as I explained last week, it's all about, the end of chapter 3 is all about das, is all about the third intellectual faculty, which we left out when we were discussing this whole process. The Alter Rebbe now puts it on the end for reasons that will become very clear, because the truth is that das is very special. The faculty of das, what's normally translated as knowledge, is an intellectual faculty, but it's not intellectual. It's both at the same time. It's of the intellect, and the correct place in the order of the soul's functions is connecting the intellect to the emotions. But on the other hand, das is not really what we normally, in the normal English term, would consider an intellectual function. Even though, as we're going to see, it does function with the intellect, and therefore it is proper to call it, as Chassidus does, the third brain, or the third aspect of the mind. But let's get to that in good time. Let us read here in Tanya. We are holding on page 14 in the Hebrew of the Tanya, Veshuv, which is, I'm trying to figure out the best way to describe where it is. It's about halfway down the page. The line starts, Seif v'tachlis upachad Hashem b'libay, and then Veshuv, almost exactly in the middle of the page, the geographic center of this page. In the English, the words are, next his heart will glow. That's the words in the English translation of the Tanya. Zok the Heilige Alter Rebbe, says the Holy Rebbe in the Tanya Kadisha, in the Holy Tanya. After the soul achieves a fear in its heart by contemplating the greatness of God, his soul will then become, his heart will then become inflamed, with a powerful love like burning fire, like burning coals. So after the godly soul achieves fear, it then achieves love. Love, interestingly, later in Tanya, as we're going to see, fear is really the higher level, ultimately. ultimately fear of God is actually higher and deeper and reaches to a more profound place than love of God does. Although what we mean by fear in this context is not really an emotional fear. Rather, it is a profound sense of nothingness and nullification before the divine, self-abnegation before the divine. But this is called the higher fear later in Tanya. Whereas love, both levels of love, or all levels of love, are normally considered a lower level or steps on the process of achieving the higher fear. Because as the Alter Rebbe famously writes, and really was mechadesh, as the Alter Rebbe famously innovates, there's a concept in Chassidus called yesh mi she'ev, that what Chassidus calls love is the behavior of something that exists, which we may think doesn't sound so bad. It's not so bad to exist. However, in terms of connection to God, the ultimate connection is a form of union in which the person does not really exist in the truest sense of the term anymore. They don't exist as a separate being from God. And the way to achieve this is not through love, because love is a relationship that exists, a relationship that occurs between two beings that both exist. So if the goal is to become non-existent, so to speak, if the goal is to become nothing within godliness, then fear can be the higher expression than love. So how come here in Tanya, when we're talking about the progression, we say first fear, then love, when really in terms of if a person is growing, if a person is progressing, it should really be love, then fear? The truth is, because here we are simply talking about the natural progression of the godly soul. In other words, we are not here discussing really Avedas Hashem. We're not really talking about where the soul pushes itself to a higher place and totally devotes itself to God in a conscious or rational way, as we'll discuss later, where in the worship of God one proceeds from love to fear, to the highest fear. Rather, here in this case, we're simply talking about the natural progression of emotions in the godly soul. What happens with, so to speak, with no extra work at all. Just contemplating the greatness of God, if the godly soul is able to do that on its own, uninterrupted and unencumbered, what it first gives birth to is a certain fear of God, and then this fear is then followed by love. Now, there are many types of love, as discussed in Chassidus. The famous two types of love are famously described in Kudra's Aveda of the Rebbe Rashab as the love of fire and the love of water. You have the fiery love, which is what Tanya is referring to here, the love like burning coals. And then you have the love of water. The difference between them, standing on one foot, is that the love of fire is a love of not possessing. It is the love of consumption, where a person is consumed by the fact that they do not possess the thing which they love. They're not one with it. Whereas the love of water is a calm love. It doesn't burn like a fire. Rather, it is the ava b'tanugim, the love of delights. It is the love of already possessing and being possessed by, of being attached to, and already in deep connection with the thing that a person loves, with the object of the love. This is called ava b'tanugim, the love of delights. And the love of delights is actually a higher love. The love of delights is the higher level. But again, here, it's the same explanation as why the love follows fear, rather than vice versa. Here we're talking merely about the natural love of the godly soul. In other words, we're not talking about the highest levels that are achieved by great tzaddikim or the truly righteous. We're not talking about a love that transcends any contemplation. We're describing very straightforwardly the reaction to a contemplation of God's greatness. And that reaction gives birth to fear. And then it gives birth, which is a sense of nullification before the divine. And then it gives birth to a love of God, a love which is generally, because it's emotional, a love that is generally from the outside. A love which is the love of not possessing. A love which is the love of being apart from. The soul loves the God that it has contemplated and realizes it is much smaller than and much lower than. And that's why this fear of God gives birth to the burning love of God, the Ava Aza, the powerful love burning like coals. Continues the Alter Rebbe, B'chashika v'chafitza. This is a love of passion and longing, v'tshuka and yearning, v'nefesh shekeka l'gedulas enseif baruch hu, a soul that is thirsting for the greatness of the Infinite One. May he be blessed. The Ein Sof, of course, being a reference, the one, literally the Ein Sof, literally the endless, the one without end, being a general Kabbalistic reference to the highest expressions of godliness. We'll leave it at that definition for now, although in other Maimarim and in other places, the definitions of this term become much more complicated and precise, and there's lots of discussion about why we refer to godliness by Ein Sof. Is it even godliness that we're referring to, or are we referring to God himself when we say Ein Sof? We will leave all of that on the shelf for now. This is a love for, we will say, for God for now. We'll treat it simply. Love of the Infinite One. And these descriptions of the soul, all these words that are used here to describe this love, you have, let's see here, you have chashika, chafitza, chuka, and nefesh shekeka. The Alter Rebbe says the desiring, yearning, wanting, and thirsting soul in love of God, with 4 different descriptions. And Rav Hillel Paritcher, the great Chassid and Tzaddik, explained that these 4 terms correspond to the 4 colors of fire that it describes in the Zohar. So if you want to find out more about the 4 different ways of yearning for God in love, so it's discussed in the Zohar, and it corresponds there to 4 colors of fire. That fire contains 4 shades within it, and those 4 shades derive from, in their spiritual source, the 4 types of yearning love for God. V'hi, and this love is Kleis HaNefesh. This is the love that is called, what Kleis HaNefesh is normally translated as the expiry of the soul, the soul's expiring. Here they translate it as the culminating passion of the soul. K'dichsiv, as the verse says, Nichsefa v'gam kalsa nafshi. My soul longs and my soul faints. Uksiv tzma nafshi lelekim, and my soul thirsts for God. Uksiv tzma lecha nafshi, and my soul thirsts for you. All these different verses describing the soul expiring, the soul yearning to break free from the bonds of separation and unite with God. This powerful yearning love, which is discussed in all of these different sources. These 3 verses, the commentators on Tanya note, correspond to the three types of the greatness of God that the soul contemplates. You have Mamale, Sevev, and God himself, the immanent light of God, the transcendent light of God, and God as he is beyond all worlds and all lights. And these 3 verses of describing the soul's yearning and the soul's thirsting actually correspond in order to these 3 levels. And this thirst derives from the element of fire in the godly soul. Now, this statement may actually ring a bell for you because we, all the way back in chapter 1, a very long time ago in this class, all the way back in chapter 1, we discussed the four elements in the animal soul. There was that, and the way that the negative traits of the animal soul derive from these four spiritual elements: fire and water and wind and earth. And we described different things, like, for example, the spiritual earth of the animal soul is its source of heaviness, right? And heaviness and sadness, whereas water is the source of its lust and desire for worldly pleasure, for example. Remember what fire was in the animal soul? Anger and arrogance. Anger and arrogance come from the fire of the animal soul. And similarly, the godly soul, for its part, also has four spiritual elements. And here, in the godly soul, the four elements, of course, constitute all of its positive traits and positive aspects. In this case, we're discussing fire, that fire is the source of this profound love and thirst for godliness. That's how this spiritual element called fire, which you can go and listen again and review if you like, the earlier class we had in chapter 1, where we discussed how the four elements are not the four physical things that they're named, that we name them by at all, but rather the spiritual, profound and subtle spiritual roots and building blocks of reality. In the godly soul, the fire of the godly soul, which fire is always ascending to its source. Fire is always rising in normal human experience. In standard human experience, fire rises and is burning up and is always trying to pull away from its own fuel. And here you have the soul desiring to pull away from its separation from God and attach itself to God. So here you see how the element of fire, the spiritual element of fire, is manifest in the love of the godly soul. As any scientist will tell you, how does he translate it here? As the students of natural science affirm, and so too it's written in the Eitz Chaim, in the writings of the Holy Arizal. What does it say? That the element of the spiritual element of fire is found in the heart, because the heart is the source of warmth in the body. Whereas the element of water and dampness is found in the brain. I can't speak for the natural sciences on this topic. I have no idea. What this means exactly, or to what natural science the Alter Rebbe is referring is the truth. Generally speaking, the natural science in Chassidus is usually pretty good, actually, on further investigation. And normally those who mock it usually end up looking quite silly, because they really don't even understand the level of investigation that's really under discussion. But what I can tell you is that the heart as the source of life, right, and passion is all associated with the heart. Passion and love is associated with the heart, the fire within the human reality. Whereas the brain is, generally speaking, as discussed elsewhere in Chassidus, is known for its coldness and detachment. It's known to be cool. It's known to be cool in the spiritual sense, that the mind, because it is the seat of abstract reasoning and detached reasoning and objective reasoning, therefore the mind is seen as cold and removed, and derives from, spiritually, coldness, whereas the heart derives from warmth. I wish I had more I could tell you about this statement about the natural sciences, which I'm sure you find as interesting as I do. But unfortunately, I don't know much more about it at this time. Still have some time. Can still learn more always, God willing. Continues the Holy Alter Rebbe. Lost my place here. As is written in the Eitz Chaim in the 50th gate, the 50th portal. Chachma, wisdom, the soul's what we called earlier in our review, the soul's direct intellectual knowledge of God is referred to as water. That's the water within the godly soul. Pardon me. Poorly written notes. Poor penmanship. Just 1 second. I see. I see. So it's interesting to note how here in the 3rd chapter of Tanya, the fire and the water, one of them corresponds to the godly soul's. Fire is the godly soul's desire to, as we said before, break free from its separation for God. It's this love of desire for God. This love like burning coals. Whereas water in the godly soul, we're saying, is actually the first and the highest of the intellectual qualities, which is interesting to contrast with in the 1st chapter, where in the animal soul, all 4 elements were discussed as emotional, which has to do with the difference between the godly soul and the animal soul. That the animal soul's nature is primarily emotional, even though it also has intellect. Whereas the godly soul, we say its nature is primarily intellectual, even though it has emotions. And so its elements are described also in intellectual terms in the Tanya. And of course, water again, as we were saying before, is an intellectual trait because of what we're saying here, that it is cold and dispassionate. If you put this back into the nature of the soul's traits, as we have been discussing them in previous class, and as we discussed them in our review today, where we're discussing the intellect as the soul's self-construction as a finite being, and relative to other finite beings, relative to external beings in the external world. And the emotions are the soul's actually relating and actually being a formed being that actually can relate to the external world. You can actually see why the intellect, why Chachma would be dispassionate, why it would be cold where the emotions would be hot. Because the entire idea of self-construction is that really there's no room for passion because there's no real relationship yet, right? Before the emotions have been constructed. In other words, as we explained in previous classes, the relationship with the thing and the intellect is a relationship of, in Chachma especially, is a relationship of simply perceiving the thing as it is. It is not a relationship of how do I relate to this thing? The I that relates to the thing is actually constructed in the emotions and comes forth fully in the emotions. It's constructed by intellect. It proceeds from the intellect. So it's very different than the emotions, where I'm already a fully formed separate being who can then be passionate towards something else, who can have an emotional connection, a fiery, in terms of, because when you think of fire, you think of dynamism, emotion. Fire is not, even later in Tanya, where we use the metaphor of the flame, the fire is not a stable system in Chassidus. It's not a stable system in the way that the Torah describes it. Fire is always consuming. The only way that fire can be stable is if it's fed more and more fuel, and it has a good wick which can draw on that fuel, all of which is discussed later in the Tanya. This is a very, very profound metaphor for the way that the soul works. But the bottom line is that fire is all about motion, dynamism. The status quo is not okay. The status quo is not fine. If the status quo stayed, this whole thing would just burn up. There's a tension. That's what you would call it. You would call it dynamic tension, dynamic equilibrium. Even when the thing is standing still, it's still moving. That's fire, right? Where there's a tension here. Whereas water is in a constant state of settling. In fact, even when water is moving, it's doing the exact same thing that it does when it sits still. The only difference is that it's not yet at the lowest place, and the lowest thing that can contain it, and so it happens to be moving. But its nature is not motion. Its nature is actually to find the perfect stillness. And the only reason that it moves is because there's something wrong with the container, or there's room to flow down and find a better container, a better place that can hold it. That's the nature of water. It's always seek the lowest place, right? Water is still. And since in the intellect, the soul is not yet constructed as a separate self, right? Why would there be any tension or dynamism? There is no self to be in tension with the thing that is perceived, right? In the mind, especially in Chachma, where, as we discussed in previous classes, especially in the first step of the intellect, where essentially the soul is in a state of profound bittul still. The soul hasn't really entered into this with its grubby little paws to try and analyze and appreciate the thing that it sees. It just simply sees something, a simple vision of the truth, right? Our example of Chachma in this chapter is God is great. That's Chachma. Chachma is God is great. The soul sees the truth of this. That's Chachma. The soul sees that God is great. Why would there be any tension in that? How could there even be any tension in that? Because all I'm doing is allowing the reality of God being great to enter into my consciousness, to enter into my awareness. So why would there be any tension? Tension comes later, where God is great, but now that truth exists next to the fact that I'm separate from that greatness, or I'm only one creation within a vast greatness of God. I'm nothing before God. That greatness and me don't really intersect in a perfect way. I'm separate from the thing that I'm perceiving, and that is fire, right? So you have the fire of the emotions, the wetness, the cool, the water, the moisture of the mind. And so these are the two elements of fire and water in the godly soul. V'shar ha'midos kulon hein anfei yira v'ahava. All of the other emotional traits, which, as we mentioned previously, the Alter Rebbe doesn't even go into in this chapter. The remaining emotional traits after Chesed and Gvura, after love and fear, are Tiferes, Netzach, Hod, Yesod, and Malchus, as all discussed in previous classes. We discussed what all of them were, if you want to go and review. Here the Alter Rebbe says simply they are all branches of love and fear, which is what we discussed. We discussed the reason why the Alter Rebbe doesn't get into all of the other emotional traits here is because the truth is that they're all just further drawing down and further concretization of love and fear. They're all bringing love and fear to a lower place. And so in a way, they're all just branches of these two core emotional traits of love and fear, which I hope you see from our discussion are not merely two feelings. It would be extremely coarse to call what the Tanya refers to as midos, as full emotions, as the full measure of a soul, as merely feelings, right? Love and fear here we're describing the fundamental contours, the fundamental form of the soul as it's constructed to relate to the other. And there's two general thrusts in that form, which is the thrust of ava, of love, which is drawing close to the other, or if you prefer, connecting to the other through a medium, through an intermediate way. And then there's fear, which is cognizance of the inability of any medium to convey our connection, or if you prefer, fleeing, running away, distance from the one that is feared. And all of the other emotions are branches of these. They're all branches v'todesein, and children of these traits, as is written elsewhere. Thus concludes the discussion in Tanya chapter 3 of love and fear. I'm in the new sentence now. As you may have noticed already, in Chassidus we have very, very long sentences, but there is a period here in the Tanya. That was the end of a sentence. And now we're reading Vahadas, das, the etymology of which in English. Vahadas, and knowledge, what we translate as knowledge, das, the third intellectual faculty. You have wisdom, which is chachma, you have understanding, which is bina, and then you have knowledge, which is called das, which so far in this chapter has been conspicuous in its absence. We did not discuss it in its natural place between bina and the emotions. We are now discussing it in its own section at the end, for reasons that will hopefully become clear because it's special. Vadas hu miloshen va'adam yada es chava. The root of the term das, of knowing, is from the verse, and Adam knew Eve, referring, of course, to intimate union. V'hu loshen hiskashrus v'hischabrus. This is a language that the word das refers to. Whenever we use the word das, knowledge, what we are really talking about is connection and attachment. Let's see how they translate. Attachment and union is how they translate it. Attachment and union is das. The way we described das in previous classes, the way we defined knowledge, was as the uniting of universes, the uniting of worlds. It is the mysterious ability of the soul to view and to understand an external reality, to be as real as the one who is understanding it. I'll say that again. Das is the soul's ability to see what it understands as real as the one who is understanding it. In other words, it is a profound form of connection. The thing that I understand is actually real. The thing of which I'm cognizant is not just a theory, but an actuality. It is you would use you may use a modern term. You would say it's entangled with my soul. Me and this thing about which I have knowledge, we are fundamentally real to each other, and therefore we cannot be separated. You cannot have one without the other. This thing, I am defined, I exist relative to the existence of this thing. It's not just an abstract notion, it's real. This is das. Das is profound connection and union. In the Talmud, where we say someone is not responsible for their own actions, like for example a minor before the age of bar or bat mitzvah, we say that they're not a bar das. They are not someone who possesses das, which is knowledge, right? And I ask you, a child before the age, if you have a 12-year, you can have a 12. The Alter Rebbe, when he was 12 years old, knew, it's hilarious to actually put it this way even, but he knew more Talmud than I will ever know when he was 12 years old, right? Which is a massive understatement, by the way. The Alter Rebbe, when he was 12 years old, knew more Torah than I will acquire in my entire life. He was an Ilui, he was a genius from a very, very young age. However, he was not yet bar mitzvah, and therefore in the eyes of the Torah, he was not yet really a bar das. He was not, generally speaking, considered to be someone with knowledge. This should be a hint that das is not an intellectual achievement in the normal sense of what we mean by intellect. If you have an understanding of a topic, das does not add a single fact, a single detail to your understanding of the thing. It is not a question. That's why knowledge is such a misleading translation, although it's possibly the best we can do. But knowledge is a misleading. It has certain connotations in English which can be misleading. We'll leave it at that. Because knowledge in English can mean the acquiring of more facts, the acquiring of more information. Here, das does not have anything to do with information. Das is not about adding facts, adding understanding. That's all bina. Bina is, I take the thing apart, I put it back together again, I analyze it, I appreciate it. I know its details, I know it in all its dimensionality, I know how it relates to other things, I know how it relates to itself. That's all bina. Das is something else. Das is, but this thing that I understand is real and relevant to me. The classic story, the classic metaphor for das comes from the Rashbat. The Rashbat was the chassid of I can't remember if he was a chassid of the Tzemach Tzedek, but definitely of the Rebbe Maharash, and definitely of the Rebbe Rashab, the fourth and fifth Lubavitcher Rebbeim. A great chassid. I believe he was even chosen by the Rebbe Rashab as the Melamed, as the Chassidus teacher of his young son, the Rebbe Rayat, of his young son, who would go on to become the sixth Rebbe of Lubavitch, which just shows you that is a vote of confidence if ever there was one. The famous metaphor of the Rashbat about das, which we would be remiss, we would get run out of the worldwide association of Tanya classes if we did not mention this in the context of das, the first time we're talking about what Chassidus calls knowledge. The famous metaphor is as follows. There's a certain peasant who lives in the shtetl, and he is illiterate, he can't read. He receives a letter or telegram, I can't remember the exact original story. He receives a letter, a telegram, some kind of message by post, but he can't read it, he can't read the words, so he takes the message to the local melamed, he takes it to the local school teacher. Of course, the school teacher has to be literate enough to teach small children the names of the letters, so that's something, I guess. And the school teacher reads him the letter. And in the letter it says that his mother has passed away. I may be paraphrasing. I can't remember the exact identity in the original metaphor of who passed away. But let's say it's his mother that passes away. And of course what happens is that the peasant standing in front of the melamed, in front of the school teacher, faints. He passes out of shock from this message. The Rashbat asks the following question. The only way that this illiterate peasant is hearing about this disturbing death in the family is through the intermediary of the school teacher. In other words, he has no direct knowledge of this thing. All knowledge that he's getting about this event is passing through the school teacher. And in fact, the school teacher is actually one step closer to the information than he is, right? He is getting it through yet another intermediary. One more step further in the chain is the peasant getting this news, whereas the melamed, the school teacher, is one step closer. He's one step closer to the information, one step closer to the to this fact about his relative who passed away. So the Rashbat asked, why is it then that it's the peasant who passes away and not the school teacher? Why is it that only the one who's hearing the news, who's the further step away, is the one who passes out, who faints, whereas the school teacher does not faint? And of course, we all understand from this very clear metaphor that the difference is that it's his mother, right? The one whose mother it is the one for whom this information is more than just information. Him and the school teacher who's reading him the letter have the same information. right? They have the same facts. They have exactly the same facts on the ground. In fact, because it's gone through one more step to reach the peasant, the teacher may even have a better grasp of the actual facts of the matter. However, the facts of the matter are not what make the difference to the emotions, as we're going to read. What makes a difference to the emotions is das. If you do not have das, if you do not have, this is my father, right? This is my mother, this is my relative, then no amount of intellect will translate into emotions. The difference is not a difference in information. It is a difference in presence, connection, attachment. You could maybe even call it awareness of a certain kind, right? It's not part of your world. You're seeing it. It cannot enter and become part of your emotional landscape in a true way unless it is real to you, unless it's your father. Whereas in connection with a different story we've told in this class before, unless you're the one that's sitting in the wheelbarrow, which is I won't tell the whole story now, but those who recognize the story will recognize it. That is Das. Das is the God that I am thinking about is my Father. Continues the Holy Alter Rebbe. Shemakasher daita. It's when the soul attaches its knowledge, bekesher amitz, with a powerful connection, v'chazak, and a strong connection, me'ed, very strong, v'yitaka machshavte b'chezek, and he affixes his thought with great strength, begdulas ein sof baruch hu, to the greatness of God, may he be blessed, ve'enai mesiach daita, and he does not remove, he doesn't have hesach hadas, which hesach hadas is a technical term in Judaism, which means a lapse of awareness. He is constantly thinking about God. In other words, you can't just know about God's greatness, God is great, and I see that that's true in Chachma, because when you see that that's true, that certainly won't give birth to any emotions, because as we discussed in a previous class, it's still very, very simple, whereas the emotions, as a complex being, cannot relate to something of that purity and that simplicity. So you have to bring it down into Bina, which Bina is the process of appreciating it as a finite truth, as something that can be known rationally with different parts, and different aspects, and different levels, that can be taken apart and put back together again, and that can be appreciated, that can be ranked, that can be dissected, that can be assigned numbers. All of these different things come in Bina. And then when you know the greatness of God with this complexity and with this deep intellectual appreciation, this is meant to actually create fear of God as an emotion. However, there is one element which is necessary, and that is that you can't just contemplate it once and see, even if you know that it's true, you can't just contemplate it briefly. On the contrary, as it says here, das means true when it comes to godliness. It's different with worldly things, okay? But with godliness, in the godly soul, in order for it to be real, you have to focus your thoughts on it at length and at depth. And I'm just telling you that at length and at depth doesn't necessarily mean more time, right? Or more words thought. They can be qualitative as well. There's such a thing as qualitative length and qualitative depth, right? It doesn't take everyone the same amount of time. But the idea is to not have hesach hadas, which means the only way that this understanding will give birth to an emotional connection is if it is a constant feature of your thinking, which I'll put it in even plainer English for you. You have to spend time with the truth of God. You have to spend time with it, with all of the implications and even figurative senses that English phrase can mean. You have to spend time with the knowledge of God, right? You have to immerse in it, right? What's the famous metaphor one of the great teachers of Chassidus gave? It says that you can have a very, very, very hot fire, right? But if you only put the kettle on it for 1 second a day, you're never going to boil the water, right? A much, much colder fire, if you leave the kettle on it consistently, I guess in Russia they would have said like the samovar, right? The urn. If you leave the urn on the fire consistently, that's what boils the water, right? That's das. The reason why that's associated with das in terms of the godly soul contemplating God is because and this is why das is considered an intellectual trait. That's why that's why das is the third of the brains, the third of the functions of the mind of the godly soul, because the godly soul's objective encounter with God is intellectual, right? The godly soul is one with God; it's a piece of God, but that's not an experience. That's what it is, right? In experience, how does that connection manifest? As we discussed in previous classes, it manifests as chachma and then in bina. It manifests intellectually. That fundamental connection is then given a vessel and expressed in intellect, in intellectual appreciation. The faith of the godly soul becomes the life force and the inner kernel and the seed of the godly soul's intellectual appreciation of God. And therefore, if the godly soul wants to spend time with God, right, just as a child spent so much time with their father, and vice versa, in ways long before it had any abstract understanding. It had spent so much time with its parents, right? And that forms the basis for a lot of the unbreakable and profound emotional relationships that are there. It forms the basis of the reality of that other person is in time spent, right? Intimate time spent, knowledge, right? Profound, close knowledge, shared experience, you would say in some of the modern lingo, right? Shared and profound experience. So if the soul wants to have shared experience with God, the place that it meets God is in its chachma and bina. And therefore, what is das? Das is, what is knowledge? What is internalization of godliness? Making God real, seeing God as your Father. It's only accomplished by spending time thinking without hesach hadas, without taking the samovar off the fire, without removing the kettle. God has to be a constant intellectual presence in the soul, and that is that shared experience, that constant attachment and presence to that reality, to that divine reality. That is what then gives birth to true and lasting emotions, true and lasting emotional relationships. If you want to be not the Melamed who's reading the telegram about God in a cold way because it's not his father. If you want to be more like the peasant who faints when they read the telegram about God, or celebrates, or faints from joy maybe, when they hear about God and when they hear the realities of godliness, then the key is das. The key is constant contemplation, and this is why. And really, this is really a much longer subject for a different time. But this is why, in the way of Chabad, in the way of serving God of the Alter Rebbe, as we're going to see in later chapters, this is why when Chassidim pray, when Chassidim who follow the Alter Rebbe daven and pray, their prayers are accompanied by periods of hisbonenus, which means contemplation. Right? In other words, there's learning a Hasidic discourse, there's learning the truth of God in the Torah. And then you're supposed to close the book and think about what you've learned, which is a different thing than learning more information. they're thinking about it not to find new information. They're thinking about it not to attain new facts of the matter. It's not studying, it's contemplating. It's having a contemplative relationship with godliness, which means spending the time in that headspace. Spending that time, the headspace is actually a term I don't like, but we'll won't even get into that. Spending that time with the reality of God that you have acquired in your Chachma and Bina. And spending that time and investing in that attachment is what then creates a true relationship, a really real relationship. And as the Alter Rebbe is about to say, only this gives birth to consistent and true emotions regarding God. Says the Holy Alter Rebbe, even someone who is very wise and very understanding, Chachma and Bina, even someone who has great Chachma and Bina, great direct intuitive wisdom, and also comprehensive understanding of the greatness of God, may he be blessed. If he does not attach his das, and fix his thoughts, with powerfully, ubahasmada, and consistently, he will not they will not give birth in his soul to true love and fear of God, ki im dimyones shav, rather only empty imaginings. And here we introduce a very important fact of the Tanya, which we'll discuss more later again, God willing, which is the idea that we are very, very able to fool ourselves about our relationship with God. It's a very, very easy thing to do. Much easier, in fact, than fooling ourselves about a relationship in the physical world. Because in the physical world, the way we encounter and the way we experience something is not only in our Chachma and Bina, but in many ways. Our senses are connected to the thing. We have lots of different ways of approaching it, because it's also a finite being like we are. When it comes to God, on the other hand, since the way that we spend time, since the way that we connect is in Chachma and Bina, is in the godly soul's capacity, intellectual capacity to bring godliness down into its own self, to create itself based on godliness, to form itself around godliness intellectually. Therefore, it's very easy to fool oneself about one's relationship with God. Feelings about God with no contemplation at all are totally untrustworthy, aren't even mentioned in this chapter. Feelings are feelings. Feelings with a lot that come from comprehension of godliness, but comprehension of godliness that's very inconsistent, right? You don't spend a lot of time thinking about God. You learn something and you're inspired, right? That's what's called here dimyones shav. That's what's called here empty imaginings, vain fancies, they translate. It's the feelings about God that come with das, with attachment, with constantly approaching that presence, with constantly approaching that reality. It's the emotions, the love and fear that are born of that are real. And what we mean by real, primarily, what we mean by amitis, what we mean by true emotions, is that they're consistent, is that they're lasting, right? In a real relationship. Real love is not the flash in the pan, here it's here today, gone tomorrow. Real love is a reflection of long shared experience, long shared emotion, right? It's always, you always think of the in Fiddler on the Roof, right, where they ask the mother where the mother's talking about if she loves Tevye, right? Tevye's wife is talking about whether she loves Tevye, and she says something like, "I've starved with him and I've suffered with him, and isn't that what love is?" And in a sense, that's a very Jewish notion of love. not just because Jews have starved and suffered, but because the idea is that real love is born only of consistent shared experience. And the truth is that with a human being, it's different than with God, as I said before, because with God, the shared experience is primarily in Chachma and Bina. But nevertheless, the true emotions, consistent emotions, real emotions come from Das. V'alkein, therefore, Das hu kiyum hamidus. Das is das knowledge. This profound attachment is what sustains the emotion. Sustains meaning over time. V'chayusan, and is their vitality. V'hu kelal chesed u'gvura, and it includes within it both chesed and gvura, both love and fear. Pirush avav anfeh v'yirav anfeh, love and its branches, and fear and its branches. Finish with the story. The story is told. The Baal Shem Tov, the holy Yisrael Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Chassidus, there's many stories about him and his horses. He was known to have horses that experienced kvitzas haderech, which means not a term invented by Frank Herbert, the writer of Dune, only borrowed by him. It's a term that means the leaping of the road, which is a fancy way of saying it is the Jewish term for teleportation, from moving quickly between one place and another in a somewhat miraculous or supernatural way. And there's many stories of the Baal Shem Tov where his horses would be going along and you'd be in his wagon and all of a sudden the horses would go into the air and you would disappear and then you would arrive somewhere that it would take days to travel. You would arrive there instantaneously. So the stories of the Baal Shem Tov go. What you make of these stories and what you think of these stories, we could have a whole Fabrengen a different time. I have an interesting story about someone who told me about what he thought of these stories, all for a different time, God willing. But the story I want to tell you now goes like this. The Baal Shem Tov has two horses on his wagon, and the two horses on the Baal Shem Tov's wagon, they start off the morning and they're going and pulling the wagon, and they feel like horses. This is hard work. We have to pull this whole heavy thing, and it has the big rabbi and all of his students on it. But then slowly the wagon begins to leave. It begins to slip the bounds, slip loose of the earth, and go into the heavens. And the two horses are staring at each other, and they start to believe that they're angels, right? They must be malachim, because horses don't fly through the sky. Angels fly through the sky. Then, of course, they're traveling, and they arrive in one city, and they go on all of these very important adventures, and they think we must be on our angelic missions, right? And then they go on to another city on the same day, and they go on their mission there, and they think, wow, we must be very important angels, because look at all the missions we're being sent on. Look at all we're God's messengers. But then finally, and they think they're so holy, they think they're so pure. Then at the end of the day, the Baal Shem Tov has the wagon driver bring the horses back to the stable, and they walk the two horses into where they live, and they put out the oats for the horses to eat. And when they eat, they don't eat like angels. When they eat like horses, right? And this is a famous Hasidic metaphor, right? Which basically means, the moral of the story is that even in prayer, which is 100% sincere and based on a 100% true appreciation of divine things, which is both of those two things are major conditions which are hard in themselves to achieve, sincerity and proper knowledge and proper understanding of a truly divine notion, of a truly array of the divine light which a person is praying with. Even this prayer can convince someone that they're like an angel. But the moment that the prayer is over, the moment the person stops davening, it goes away, as the Alter Rebbe will describe later in Tanya, and it doesn't leave a trace. It's as if it never happened. The person's emotions and his emotional life, while they were inflamed and he had a certain feeling for a time, he wasn't truly transformed. He goes back to eating like a horse, right? The goal, as we're going to see, of the whole Chassidus Chabad, in a way, of the Alter Rebbe's whole approach, the goal is das. The goal is that it should be absolutely real. Because when it's real, it has an effect. A person who really davens with das, who really prays to God with a true divine contemplation, and then that divine contemplation is truly felt in its reality. The person puts in the time to appreciate that this is actually the truth of my Father. This isn't an abstract notion. This is the reality in my own life. That, and only that, is what gives birth to true transformational emotional relationships. And just a final note, in case you were wondering what the source is of contemplating God before prayer, possibly at length, I heartily recommend you check out not a Hasidic work necessarily, but the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, where it describes how a person is to prepare themselves for prayer. You will see there that it discusses exactly what the Alter Rebbe is discussing here in Tanya, the importance of contemplating the greatness of God. God willing, next time we will begin chapter 4 of the Holy Tanya.